My son opened the envelope at the dinner table, looked at what was inside for about 3 seconds, and passed it across the white linen to his father-in-law without saying a word. Arden Keswick, silver-haired, a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly rent, the kind of man who moved through the world like it had been designed specifically for him. Lifted one of the certificates by the edge and held it up. He examined it the way you examine something you've never seen before and can't quite believe exists. "Paper stock certificates," he said. Not to me. To the table, from the 90s. He set it down gently on the cloth and leaned back with a smile that was too smooth to be unkind and too practiced to be anything else. "I haven't seen one of these in years. It's like finding a rotary phone in a junk drawer." A few people laughed. My son, Bryce, 37, a junior partner at a law firm downtown, laughed too. Not loud. Just a soft, reflexive sound, the way you laugh when you want someone to know you're not associated with the embarrassing thing. Not with me. "Mom, that's really sweet," he said. "But nobody does paper certificates anymore. Everything's handled through digital accounts now." His wife, Heather, was looking at her wine glass. I reached across the table and picked up the envelope. I put it back in my purse. I said good night to everyone. 8 people in total, none of them looking at me directly, got my coat from the back of the chair, put it on myself, and walked out of the restaurant. The 12 bus came in 7 minutes. I sat in the back and watched the city pull past in the dark. I'd worked the food service line at Mercy General Hospital for 31 years. I'd learned early on that some feelings belong at home, behind a closed door, somewhere private. Not on city buses. Not at dinner tables either, apparently. I saved this one for later. I knew I had time. Let me go back a little, to how any of this started. When Bryce's father left, my son was 6 years old and I had $400 in a savings account and a studio apartment on Millbrook Avenue. I worked the morning shift at Mercy General, in at 5:45, out at 2, then I'd pick Bryce up from after-school care. The apartment was small enough that you could hear everything from anywhere in it. The heat came from a single radiator that knocked all night in winter. I didn't mind. It was ours. We were warm. I started reading about investing from library books. Not because anyone told me to. Nobody in my family had ever had a brokerage account, and the word portfolio belonged to a world I watched from the outside. But I was 31 years old with a child to raise, and no one coming to help me, and I understood, bone deep, that the only thing standing between us and nothing was the work I put in and the choices I made with what it earned. $40 a month at first, index funds, a company that let you start small. Then 60, then 100 when the overtime came. I fixed the things that broke in that apartment myself rather than calling the landlord and watching the money disappear into fees. I packed Bryce's lunch every morning until he was old enough to be embarrassed by it. And then I still packed it and just didn't mention it. In 1997, I was waiting for an elevator at Mercy General when I overheard 2 men in suits talking about a small regional law firm looking for outside investors to fund an expansion. They were dismissive about it. Too small, too much risk, not enough name recognition to be worth the trouble. I wrote down the name on the back of my break schedule. That weekend I went to the library. Clarendon and Associates, founded 1989, 12 attorneys. Commercial litigation and estates work, solid track record. Looking for private investors to fund a second office location. Everyone I mentioned it to said it was a bad idea. Too risky for someone in my position. Keep the money somewhere safe. I bought in anyway. It took everything I had in a secondary account. Money I'd been keeping back for exactly the kind of opportunity that everyone tells you is too dangerous to take. Paper certificates arrived in the mail 2 weeks later. I filed them in the folder with the important documents. Bryce's birth certificate, the savings bonds my mother left me, the insurance policy I'd taken out the week his father left. Over the years, I watched Clarendon grow. I watched it become the firm it became, And eventually I watched my son get a job there and work his way toward partner, without ever knowing I was a name in the shareholder registry. I hadn't told him because I wanted him to earn his place himself. I wanted to know who he'd become without the money making it complicated. It's the story I told myself for a long time. I'm still not certain whether it was wisdom or a kind of cowardice. Maybe both things at once. I got home from the restaurant at 10:15. My apartment was quiet in the particular way. Small apartments are quiet when you've lived in them long enough. The specific sound of the refrigerator cycling, the upstairs neighbor's floor shifting, traffic on the street below settling into its late rhythm. I put my purse on the table and made a cup of tea I didn't drink. I sat with the envelope for a while. The certificates were still inside, still real, still the same thing they'd been before. Arden Keswick held one up by the corner like a curiosity. My son's laugh echoed in a way I hadn't expected it to. I went to bed eventually. I lay in the dark and thought about 31 years of early morning shifts, and what 31 years of showing up quietly and consistently looks like when you take it out of the envelope and hold it under the light. I thought about all the decisions made at the margins, the overtime I'd taken, the vacations I hadn't, the vacations I planned, the apartment I'd stayed in long past when I could have moved somewhere larger, because every dollar I didn't spend on comfort I could put towards something that would outlast me. I thought about Bryce at 6 years old, sleeping with one arm thrown over his head the way he always slept, trusting completely that everything was being handled. I'd handled it. I just hadn't shown him the receipts. In the morning, I called Clive. Clive had managed my accounts for 14 years. He was 62, a former bank examiner, a man of few words and precise judgment, who wore the same gray cardigan to every meeting and never once made me feel like a curiosity sitting across from him. That had always mattered more than I'd told him. I put the envelope on his desk. He took out the certificates, went through them carefully, and looked up at me over his reading glasses. "You didn't give these to Bryce." I tried to. He didn't say anything to that. He set the certificates down and turned his monitor so I could see it. Then he walked me through everything the way he always did, methodically, in plain language, the way you talk to someone you respect. Index funds, a real estate trust, municipal bonds purchased in 2009 when everyone else was selling. The Clarendon stake now held through a custodial account since the firm had moved to electronic equity tracking in 2018. 26 years of dividend reinvestments. Total portfolio value, $11,430,000. The Clarendon equity stake, at current firm valuation, $2,280,000. I already knew the numbers. I'd built them 1 year at a time across 3 decades. But there is a difference between carrying something in your chest and hearing it spoken out loud in a quiet office on a Wednesday morning. It became real in a different way. Solid. Present. "Is there something else?" I asked, because I could see by the way he held his pen that there was. He set it down. "There's something I've been meaning to call you about. I want you to look at something." He pulled up a secondary screen. Over the past 4 months, there had been unusual filings in Clarendon's equity structure. A private equity group called Keswick Capital was in advanced discussions to acquire a controlling stake in the firm. The acquisition, as structured, would reclassify minority shareholder equity on a liquidation basis, reducing it to near zero. It would also redirect a portion of the associates' deferred compensation pool into a bridge fund controlled by the acquiring entity during the transition period. The people who had invested in Clarendon over the years, people like me, would lose almost everything they were owed. Associates who deferred portions of their compensation toward retirement would find those funds inaccessible for years. "Keswick Capital," I said out loud. Clive nodded slowly. "Arden Keswick is the principal." I looked at him. "He's my son's father-in-law," I said. Clive was quiet for a moment. He wrote something on his legal pad, then reached into his desk drawer and handed me a business card for a man named Quincy, a former SEC field examiner who now worked private financial investigations. "If you want to understand what's actually happening inside that deal," Clive said, "he's the right person to call." I called him that afternoon. "If you've stayed with me this far, I want to ask you something. If you were in my position, sitting with what I had in that folder, would you have warned your son first? Or would you have waited?" Drop yes or wait in the comments below. I read every single one. And subscribe if you want to hear the rest. I'm going to finish this. One note before I do. Some details here have been adjusted for privacy, but everything that matters in this story is real. Now, here's what Quincy found. He called back in 5 days and asked to meet. We sat in a booth at a diner on the east side of town, mid-afternoon, the place half empty and quiet enough to talk. He was a careful, compact man who didn't use more words than a situation required. He opened a folder on the table between us and let me read before he spoke. Bryce had been providing non-public information about Clarendon's client portfolio to Keswick Capital for 8 months. Email correspondence, internal billing summaries from restricted client falsons, meeting notes from strategy sessions. Information protected under attorney-client privilege and securities law. He had been feeding the man trying to buy the firm everything Keswick needed to assess its real value before finalizing acquisition terms. Wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, securities violations. Did he know what the deal structure would do to the minority shareholders? I asked. Quincy turned a page. There were printed emails from March. Bryce writing directly to Arden Keswick, asking about the minority equity position. Keswick's replies were smooth and reassuring. It would be handled appropriately at closing. It was standard restructuring language. Nothing to worry about. Bryce had accepted those answers without pushback. I sat with that for a long moment. My son hadn't asked what was in the envelope I'd brought to dinner. He hadn't asked what the acquisition terms would do to the people who'd trusted Clarendon with years of their working lives. He'd taken reassurances from the same man who'd held my stock certificate up like a relic and laughed. "What do you want to happen?" Quincy asked. I thought about calling Bryce. I'd imagined the conversation. "Mom, you don't understand how these deals work. You work in a hospital cafeteria." He wouldn't be wrong about my job. He'd be wrong about everything else. "I want a meeting with Lamont Birch," I said, "senior managing partner at Clarendon. I want to walk in as a shareholder of record." Quincy looked at me steadily. "You understand what comes after that? My son has already made the decisions that end his career at that firm," I said. "I'm just going to make sure the right people understand what those decisions were." Lamont Birch's office was on the 14th floor, high ceilings, bookshelves floor to ceiling, the particular silence that comes with expensive carpet and good windows. His assistant had looked at me twice when I came through the lobby. Once at my face, once at my coat. The good navy one, 9 years old. I'd worn it on purpose. Lamont stood when I came in. Late 60s, white-haired, with the careful posture of someone who'd spent 40 years making first impressions. I put Quincy's documentation folder on his desk before I sat down. "My name is in your shareholder registry," I said. "I've held a 3.1% equity stake in this firm since 1997. I'm here because I have documented evidence of securities violations being prepared under this firm's name, and as a minority shareholder, I have the right to bring it to your attention." He sat, he opened the folder, he read. I watched his face move through several things in a short amount of time. After about 12 minutes, he looked up. "How long have you had this?" "Long enough to be certain of it," I said. He picked up his phone and made 2 calls, one to the firm's general counsel, the second, and I understood why, even though I hadn't asked for it, to Bryce. My son arrived 12 minutes later, moving fast the way you move when you've been called up urgently and don't know why. He pushed through the door without knocking and stopped cold when he saw me sitting across from Lamont Birch's desk. I watched his face work through everything in about 4 seconds. Confusion first, then recognition, then the weight of understanding settling in below his sternum before it reached his eyes. "Mom," his voice came out small. "Why are you? What is this?" "Sit down, Bryce," Lamont said. He sat. Lamont walked him through the folder. I watched my son try denial first. The emails were out of context. There were factors. I didn't understand about deal structuring. Arden had personally assured him the minority position would be protected. His voice carried the professional steadiness of someone trained to argue in courtrooms, and I could hear him reaching for it and finding it wasn't holding. Then Lamont showed him the equity restructuring clause, the one that reduced minority shares to near zero on liquidation, the one that redirected the associates' pension pool into a bridge fund during transition. Bryce went quiet. "You knew this," Lamont said, not a question. The room held still. Bryce looked at me. I looked back at him. I wasn't angry. I'd moved through angry in the night after the restaurant and come out the other side. I was just present. There in a way I hadn't been allowed to be at that dinner table when nobody had thought to ask what was in the envelope. "I didn't know you had shares," he said finally. His voice cracked on the last word. "You didn't ask what was in the envelope," I said quietly. "You didn't ask what I'd built. You passed it across the table to a man you wanted to impress, and when he laughed, you laughed with him." Arden Keswick arrived 20 minutes later, summoned by a call I wasn't part of. He came in with the composure of a man who expected to control whatever room he entered. He took one look at the documents spread across the desk, one look at his son-in-law's face, and his composure lasted about 40 seconds. When Lamont named the equity restructuring clause, when he said minority shareholder, and looked at me as he said it, Arden shifted his weight and said the emails had been mischaracterized, that Bryce had been acting on his own initiative, that Keswick Capital's deal structure was entirely standard market practice. Bryce looked at the man who had called my gift a museum piece and said, very quietly, "You told me it was standard language. You told me no one would be harmed." Arden said nothing. Heather arrived last. She'd been waiting downstairs. Bryce had apparently called her from the hallway. She came in, looked at her father's face, and something moved across hers that I hadn't expected. Not hostility toward me, not defense. Something more like the expression of a person seeing clearly for the first time and not liking the clarity. She moved toward the far wall. She didn't stand beside her father. She stood alone. That stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that afternoon. The Keswick Capital acquisition did not close. Lamont Birch referred the matter to the State Bar's Ethics Board and to the firm's Securities Counsel, who coordinated with the SEC. A formal inquiry into Keswick Capital's acquisition practices opened within 3 weeks. 2 institutional clients withdrew from Arden Keswick's investment group before the month was out. Bryce resigned from Clarendon before the internal review concluded. I learned later, through someone I trust, that he had cooperated fully with the ethics inquiry and disclosed his own role without minimizing it. I don't know everything that cost him. I know it was the right thing, and that the right thing is often harder than it looks from the outside. He called me 11 times in the 2 weeks following the meeting. I let most of those calls go. Not to punish him. That wasn't it. Some silences need to be kept until the person stopped rehearsing what they want to say and started telling the truth instead. When I finally answered, he didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask why I hadn't warned him, or how long I'd been a shareholder, or what any of this meant going forward. He said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for the restaurant and for not seeing you clearly for a long time." That was enough to begin. The shareholder equity was purchased at fair market value when new management assumed control of the restructured firm. I put those funds into the Ellis Fund, named for Ellis Street, where I grew up, the block where my mother hung laundry in the backyard, and my father disappeared before I understood what disappearing meant. The fund provides continuing education grants for hospital support staff at Mercy General, dietary aides, custodians, patient transport workers, supply technicians, the people who hold a hospital together before the visitors arrive and after they leave, the ones who are always there and rarely seen. The first year, we awarded 14 grants. I was at the ceremony in the hospital's main conference room. The same building I've walked into every morning for 31 years, the same hallways I know by the sound their floors make in different weather. I stood near the back. A woman in her early 50s, a dietary aide named Rosario, 22 years on the overnight shift, stood at the front with her acceptance letter to a registered nursing program and tried to hold herself together in front of her colleagues. She didn't quite manage it. Neither did I. I wasn't ashamed of that. I still work my shifts. I've thought about stopping, and each time I think about it, I understand a little more clearly why I won't. The morning line is where I know what I'm doing and why. The people around me are the reason. They've always been the reason. The apartment is still the same apartment, 19 years in this building. The window that rattles in January, the radiator that takes 20 minutes to commit. I could move somewhere easier. I choose this. The choosing still matters to me. Above the kitchen table, I have one thing framed on the wall. The certificate, the original from 1997, Clarendon and Associates, ink a little faded, edges soft with age. The one Arden Keswick held between two fingers at a restaurant table and called a museum piece. Bryce came to dinner last month. I made pot roast, my mother's recipe, the one I've been making since before he was born. He sat at my table and ate and didn't look at his phone once. At the end of the night, he stood at the wall and looked at the frame for a long time without saying anything. "Is that the one from the restaurant?" he asked. "Yes." He was quiet. "I should have asked what was in the envelope," he said. "You should have," I said, "but you're here now." He nodded. He didn't try to add anything to that. There's a kind of intelligence in knowing when not to put more words on something. They don't teach it in law school. It takes longer to learn and a harder way to learn it. Before he left, he hugged me, both arms, the way he used to when he was small, and still believed I was the most capable person in the world. He wasn't entirely wrong. To you listening to this story, if you're someone who gets up before the sun and comes home after dark and wonders sometimes whether any of it is being counted or seen, it is. The dignity in that work is real. I know because I've lived it for 31 years, and what I built in the margins of those years changed lives. Not just my own. And to anyone who's ever looked past someone because of what they do instead of who they are, be careful. The person handing you a meal tray might own shares in the building you're walking through. Or they might not. It doesn't change what they're worth. I never built what I built to surprise anyone or prove a point. I built it because I believed in something better, even when the evidence was thin. Even when I was eating alone and the radiator wasn't working and my son was asleep in the corner and I was the only one who knew we were going to be all right. Not a museum piece, not a rotary phone in a junk drawer. A foundation built one decision at a time across 31 years by a woman in a food service uniform who always knew exactly what she was doing and chose, every single morning, to keep doing it anyway.